It's nice to see you all here, and thank you for joining us for this very interesting, enriching lecture by Miriam Friedman Morris. My name is Galit Gertzenzon, and it is my honor to lead the Ziegler Studies program here at Ball State University, in addition to my role as faculty at the Honors College. Miriam's visit today is truly a treat. It's enriching us with history, and I want to thank several of you that made this visit happen. First of all, I'd like to thank our minion here, our Ziegler Jewish Studies Committee that sits right here with us. Thank you for being here. I would like to extend gratitude to Professor Rachel Kahn from the Ball State School of Art, who helped organize classroom visits for Miriam, and also for our director of the David Owsley Art Museum, Robert. Thank you so much for making this an unforgettable experience for Miriam. And now I would like to turn things over to President Jeffrey Mearns, who will be introducing our speaker tonight.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to join you this evening, and I want to thank all of you for joining us for this very important program. As Galit said, in just a few moments, our guest will speak about her Jewish parents, both of whom survived the Holocaust. And she'll talk about her work, the important work that she does, to preserve her father's artistic legacy. But before I introduce her, I want to acknowledge Benjamin and Bessie Ziegler, the couple and the foundation who is responsible for funding our Jewish Studies program. This program was established to provide our campus and our local communities with an understanding and an appreciation for Jewish history, Jewish culture, and the Jewish faith. And I'm grateful to Galit and to the committee Galit for serving as the program director, and to the committee and the School of Arts and the Honors College for helping to organize and promote this program. So as you know, we've gathered here this evening to hear from our guest, our special guest, Ms. Miriam Friedman Morris. Ms. Morris is the daughter of David and Hildegard Friedman. David Friedman was born in 1893 in the region of Austria-Hungary that later became Czechoslovakia and which is now the Czech Republic. As just a teenager, Mr. Friedman moved to Berlin where he received a scholarship to study art. During World War I, he served as an artist in the Austro-Hungarian army, painting portraits of generals and drawing battle scenes at the Russian front. And after that war, Mr. Friedman was a successful painter and portrait artist in Berlin until the Nazi Party tried to end his career. In 1938, Mr. Friedman and his first wife, along with their infant daughter, fled Germany for Prague. Several years later, the family was deported to Lodz ghetto. When the ghetto was evacuated in 1944, Mr. Friedman was separated from his wife and daughter, neither of whom survived. Mr. Friedman was then transported to Auschwitz-Birkenau and then the satellite camp Livitz, where he endured brutal conditions. He survived the death march to Blechhammer and was liberated there in 1945 at the age of 51 years old. The next year, in 1946, Mr. Friedman met Miriam's mother, Hildegard, herself a survivor of concentration camps. The couple fled communist Czechoslovakia for Israel and then finally settled in the United States, where they raised their daughter, Miriam, who is here with us tonight. Throughout his lifetime, Mr. Friedman continued to create art, including paintings and portraits that chronicled his Holocaust experience. And now this evening for us, Miriam is going to share more about her father's passion for art, his years in the concentration camps, and his strong will to survive. She's also going to tell us about her family's long-standing efforts to recover some of Mr. Friedman's pre-war artwork, much of which was confiscated by the Nazis. And so we're fortunate. We're fortunate that Miriam could join us because the personal nature of her family's story is even more powerful and more poignant than any Holocaust lesson we could read in a history book. Her presence here tonight reminds us of the impact the Holocaust had on real people's lives. And it's more important than ever that we remember the stories like those of her family. As many of you are aware, anti-Semitic acts continue in our country and in our world. So we must remain vigilant against such incidents of discrimination and hate. Whether these acts occur far away or in our own country, our community, they are frightening. They cause terror, and we must support our Jewish students and our colleagues. Earlier this month, I shared an email with the campus community expressing my support for a bill that is now working its way through the Indiana legislature. If passed, this bill, House Bill 1037, would define anti-Jewish bias and discrimination. The bill is important. It offers support for our Jewish friends and our Jewish neighbors. This bill also serves as a guide for recognizing and combating anti-Semitic incidents. And I believe it's important for our nation's leaders, particularly our elected officials, to do what they can with the power that they have to combat anti-Semitism. And I believe that our best weapon in this ongoing battle, this war against hate, is education. We must continue educating ourselves and other people about Jewish history and Jewish culture. We must continue attending events like this one, events that make it impossible for us to forget the atrocities of the Holocaust. And we must honor our moral obligation to respond forcefully, unequivocally, against racism and anti-Semitism wherever and whenever it may arise. And for that reason, it is my distinct honor to introduce to you Ms. Miriam Friedman Morris.
Thank you, President Mearns, for your warm introduction and warm, impressive speech. I also would like to thank Galit Gertsen for inviting me and all who made this program possible. And a special thanks also to Robert LaFrance, for the director of the Owsley Art Museum, for the special tour and interest in my father. And of course, Professor Rachel Leah Coleman for assisting and scheduling all those wonderful tours throughout the campus and different classrooms. It has been a very wonderful experience here at Ball State University. And I am so honored to be the guest lecturer on this really important occasion of Holocaust remembrance. I appreciate this opportunity to speak about my father, David Friedman, and show his artwork. Have a look at this family. This is me at the age of 10 with my father, David, and mother, Hildegard, both Holocaust survivors. My father had won his decades-long case against Germany for his Nazi-looted art and property. He lost hundreds of etchings, lithographs, paintings, drawings, and his epic story continues today as new art surfaces. From childhood, I was intrigued about his pre-war life and the unknown fate of his Nazi-looted art. My father's pursuit for justice inspired my quest to find lost works and to rescue him from obscurity. To tell the story of my father's life through art, I will show many discoveries that my father never saw again. A full-page article in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch on the occasion of his sensational restitution win, my father's new celebrity made a great impression on me, even as a young child. The International Supreme Court in Berlin adjudicated an upward adjustment from his 1954 compensation. He was among the first to receive restitution for Nazi-looted artwork. This award did not consider the damage inflicted on his professional growth as an artist, loss of career, or persecution endured because he was a Jew. There is no compensation for the murder of family and suffering at the hands of the Nazis. David Friedman was a prolific artist with many talents. The will and drive I saw in him carried over in my life. He was born in Mariš Ostrov in 1893 in Austria-Hungary, today Ostrava, Czech Republic. He apprenticed as a sign painter and ventured to Berlin at the age of 17 and studied painting with Lovis Corinth and etching with Hermann Struck. My father wrote a diary for me at the time of my birth in Israel. He reflects on his deportation to the Lodz ghetto with his first wife Matilda and child Miriam, who I was named after. He writes about befriending a young woman, his future wife Hildegard Tausig, and her help to hang his first exhibition after liberation in the town hall of Český Dub, Czechoslovakia in January 1946. This cycle was among the first exhibitions of Holocaust art in the world. He continued to paint his haunting memories and exhibit his work. The diary was like an introduction into my parents' lives. But it wasn't until after my father's death in 1980 I began to learn more about his art and the missing gaps. He had captured Jewish life and the rich cultural world before Hitler came to power. And here is a joyous occasion of my parents' wedding, attended by friends, mostly survivors, in Prague. The bride's father, Karl Tausig, is to her right, wearing the hat. Everywhere David Friedman went, he left an art legacy to find. And most of the work he never saw again, that you will be seeing now. In 1923, my father learned about an international chess tournament which would be held in his birthplace of Marish Ostrow, or Ostrava at that time. He met with the former world chess champion Emanuel Lasker in Berlin, who was enthused about his idea to produce a portfolio of portraits of the 14 players. 50 years later, my father found one portfolio at the Ostrava Museum. Finally, he had something to show from his pre-war career. Proudly, he displayed the 14 black and white photos and said, "You see, Miri, I was really a famous artist before the war. I was known for these chess portraits." The emotion and excitement about this discovery planted a seed for my destiny ahead. When I visited the Ostrava Museum in 1994, the portfolio had vanished. It surfaced again in 2006 in the museum library collection, where no one thought to look for it. The director was filled with emotion as she saw it at the bottom of the pile of books. In 2013, the portraits were part of a special exhibition about the Jews of Ostrava. From 50 produced portfolios, I found 6 under 2 different titles. Friends were also portrayed, among them Elizabeth and James Rothstein. Rothstein was a composer, conductor, and pianist who played his last concert in May 1941 in Berlin. The following November, he was deported to the Lodz ghetto, where he was murdered. The portraits turned up in Israel. My father thought these were the only original portraits from 2000 that survived. Their location today is unknown. The second seed was like a rocket that propelled me into uncharted waters. While still a college student, I found my father's portrait of his beloved first wife, Matilda. I visited Berlin in 1970 and met Aunt Käthe Friedman, my father's non-Jewish sister-in-law. Upon entering the apartment, the paintings on the wall transmitted a certain familiarity. These were my father's paintings. Perhaps my father wanted to surprise me, or I was going to surprise my father. But I could never have imagined such a reaction when I gave him the photos. He was shocked and felt deceived. His own sister-in-law kept this from him. After all, she knew about his search for his lost art. She had testified on his behalf. My father fought to retain it, but the others in the apartment are still lost today. When the painting arrived, my father hung it in the bedroom, and he remained there for 3 days. This is my father's apartment in Berlin. Hanging second from the left is a painting, let's see if I can do this. This painting is the Berliner Dome that I saw in Aunt Käthe's apartment. The other oil painting is a mountain and sea landscape. Both were produced about 1928. My innocent role of finding pre-war paintings set the stage to find more works, but it wasn't until the 1980s that I thought I could find something to bring justice to my father. By the early 1990s, I had written to every possible German and Czech institute and government agency about the whereabouts of my father's art. This is letter writing, not email. I learned of looted art in the wartime collections of the Jewish Museum in Prague. Several pieces by my father were looted from other Jewish victims. This 1914 etching was the earliest dated piece found among several at the Jewish Museum in Prague in 2002. The scene depicts a gathering under a tent to celebrate a holiday. The light of a burning candle illuminates the faces encircling the table where the rabbi and attendees stand in silhouette. He produced the etching at the age of 20 during his Berlin student years, and it was dedicated to his patron, director Mr. Silberger. It was exciting to see my father's early Jewish-themed art. David Friedman was a successful artist selling portraits, late Impressionist landscapes, still life, interiors, and nudes. In the 1930s, Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany brought paintings to Palestine and other countries around the world. In 1953, in Israel, my father was thrilled to see his paintings again and took black and white photos for an album. He wrote descriptions, the important clue to the whereabouts of his work. After decades-long search, I connected to descendants of the Wolf family and finally could see my father's student work in color. World War I was the first of many life-changing interruptions in his career. He served as a battle artist in the Austro-Hungarian army on the Russian front. His last station was Piotrków, Poland in 1918. My father wrote he was permitted to draw and paint for himself and produce lithographs. 84 years later, work from this era has surfaced, first at the Jewish Museum in Prague and in 2020 at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. The lithograph shows he visited a cheder, a Jewish boys' school in Piotrków. Another mosaic stone fell into place. And here is the teacher again with the boys in the Jewish school. Both pieces were looted by Reich authorities from the art collection of the Jewish community in Berlin. This lithograph, number 32, was another looted piece that turned up at the Jewish Museum in Prague. Number 2 of this very same piece was found in Vienna by a United States private collector. After World War I, he returned to Berlin and read about the pogroms in the newspapers. Outraged by the pogrom, the progression of violent attacks against the Jews in Eastern Europe, he hoped to bring attention to this organized massacre. He never would have believed this foreshadowed the world's worst pogrom, and he would not only be an eyewitness to mass annihilation and destruction, but also a victim. In 1954, my father received 2 pages of his work torn from this journal. This is one of the pieces. He wrote, "These are the last and only evidence of my approximately 2,000 paintings that comprise my life's work." I was shaken to the core. I found the original etching dedicated to his violin teacher in the graphics collection Schüling at the University of Gießen in Germany. This is the only surviving etching from a series of 12. My father enjoyed a successful career and exhibited at the Akademie der Kunst, the Berliner Secession, and numerous galleries in Germany and in Czechoslovakia. This rare painting belonged to an art dealer and gallery owner in Cologne, Germany, who specialized in artists from the 1920s. The view of my father's studio shows the promise of a young artist with a brilliant future, but survives as a memento from a shattered world. The widespread recognition for my father's chess master portraits propelled his art into a new direction and a second career. He became a leading press artist of the 1920s and produced hundreds of portraits of celebrated personalities from the arts, music, theater, sports, politics, and industry that were published mainly in the German newspapers and the radio program magazine Der Deutsche Rundfunk. He sketched politicians in the Berlin Parliament and scientists, the likes of Albert Einstein. Now I had to find them. A number of his most famous subjects turned up in small local papers with the absolute worst print and paper quality. Also, portraits printed from microfiche show a loss of soft shading and fine detail compared to the original. Nevertheless, whatever the conditions, what a find. My father's passion for music resonated in his art. It was a thrill to discover not only world-famous musicians and composers, but also those long forgotten and obscured by the Nazis. In 2008, the Berlin Philharmonic honored my father with an exhibition reproducing his lost musician portraits, which traveled to New York, Tel Aviv, and Jerusalem. These renowned personalities in the music and arts were murdered by the Nazis because they were Jews. Hundreds of published portraits from the 1920s and early 1930s were discovered and cataloged. Many of these subjects have been lost to history, but are remembered through the enduring art of David Friedman. Eventually, they are going to be online for researchers and historians and the public at the Leo Baeck Institute in New York. When Hitler came to power in 1933, David Friedman was banned from his profession and could only sell to Jewish clientele. After World War I, he had automatically become a Czech citizen and thus could establish a business renovating buildings until this too was prohibited for Jews. Discoveries would show he did not forsake his art, as this example of two musicians performing at the Jüdische Kulturbund, which means Jewish Culture Association. And because this was photographed, you can see the difference in of the fine line. The portraits come more to life in contrast to the microfiche drawings you just saw. The Nazi regime allowed the Jüdische Kulturbund to exist as part of their efforts to mask the actual extent of the oppression of the Jews. To attend a concert felt almost like normal times, but sadly this was a false pretense. At the end of 1938, the Friedman family left everything behind and fled to Prague. My father only had his artistic talents as a means to survive. In 1941, his left-behind artwork in Berlin was looted by the Gestapo. He introduced himself to the leaders of the Jewish community in Prague, many of them prominent Zionists who became heads of Theresian ghetto and later were murdered in Auschwitz. He made it known he wished to produce an album and received orders for portraits. His series of the Prague Jewish community, 1940 to 1941, is a historic record of a dynamic community that was destroyed. In some cases, his portrait is the only surviving image of a victim. More than 100 portraits have survived, and I donated my father's album to the Yad Vashem Art Museum. The Nazis aimed to deny all Jews their rights and even the solace music provides. Despite the danger, Jews gathered for clandestine concerts to experience a few hours away from the grim reality of their lives. The photo of this drawing is the only surviving document of the Kraft Quartet. David Friedman survived the Lodz Ghetto, Auschwitz-Birkenau, the subcamp Gleiwitz I, and the death march to Blechhammer. He was liberated there on January 25, 1945 by the Red Army at 51 years, an age significantly older than most survivors. His burning desire was to show to the world the ruthless persecution and inhumanity as practiced by the Nazis so that it would never happen again. He bore witness to Nazi Germany's killing of innocents and later titled his series, Because They Were Jews. Personalized descriptions supplement his artwork, creating a singularly detailed pictorial and written record of the Holocaust. A little-known post-war Czech history was a nationwide desire to deport the ethnic Germans. My father was invited to show his 34 paintings and drawings in the former Sudetenland towns near the German borders. Announcements and posters invited Slav nationals to a celebratory opening and viewing of the exhibition, with compulsory attendance for ethnic Germans over the age of 15 years. Every visitor paid admission. Germans who failed to appear did not receive their ration cards. So my father's artwork was used as a denazification tool in the towns near the German borders where many Nazis had also lived. On October 16, 1941, the Friedman family was sent on the first transport from Prague to the Lodz ghetto. In this deportation scene, the mother and child in center back has a striking resemblance to the photograph. So in my mind, when my father created this drawing, he was thinking of his wife and child. Of course, he was thinking of them always when he was producing this artwork. After his deportation to the Lodz ghetto, his artwork in Prague was looted by Nazi authorities. This drawing on the way to a concentration camp, he writes, "Children, adults, accompanied by soldiers with fixed bayonets, walked with all their baggage to the train, where 1,000 Jews were pushed in like sardines. It is unnecessary to describe what went on in a completely sealed car for 2 days and 2 nights, and this was just the beginning. Windows were not permitted to be opened." In the Lodz ghetto, 70 adults and 17 children lived in my room. The supplies were partially depleted. Thieves forced their way to our luggage and took everything. Exhaustion, hunger overcame us, and we saw many people not wake up anymore. Those who could work were able to buy something to eat. Soon the toilets were too full, and the cleaning was a catastrophe. Sicknesses were the rule, under which we suffered greatly. Again, many more from our transport died. The victims from the transports were unprepared for what awaited them. They faced squalid, crowded living conditions, wintry weather with no heat and little food. The rooms were only 4 walls without running water or any other amenities. There was little room for belongings or privacy. He continues, "In the unending misery, I found motives that had always interested me. With death before my eyes, through hunger and sickness, I worked strenuously on a series of drawings, etchings, and paintings which documented our fate." This is an everyday scene. This is an everyday scene of starving children peddling on the streets. Food played the most important role in the ghetto. Eating in a public kitchen or eating at home in the Lodz ghetto, the consequences were the same. Many Jews died every day from hunger and disease. The victims' faces express the despair of their hopeless situation, daily struggle to survive in the ghetto. Dear reader, the Germans had posters taped up on all the streets that we were prohibited to leave the ghetto. Those who tried would be immediately shot. I saw this with my own eyes at the German fence. However, it never occurred to me to climb over the fence. This would have been insanity. Ultimately, there was no other choice except to continue on our path of suffering. In this drawing, you can see the somber expressions on the faces of the 2 men next to a barbed wire fence and the watching Schutzpolizei, the protection police, at his post with a rifle and bayonet. At the Beludi marketplace, 18 Jews were executed by hanging in one day. All persons, including children from the incoming transports, were ordered to the large marketplace. This action was ordered by the German ghetto administrator, Hans Bieber, because they tried to escape. My father writes, "The impressions are today still very strong and unforgettable, and will always rule my life, even against my will." There was a pump in the yard that supplied the water. One came down from whatever floor one lived with a bucket and turned the pump wheel and filled the bucket. The toilet was just a large dugout with a structure for privacy and a row of cubicles. So you can understand how people outside the ghetto felt meeting up with such conditions. The native Lodz residents were used to it. Only minor parts of Lodz had sewers or running water. Jews were forced, of course, had forced labor in the ghetto. And this is a wagon filled with bricks pulled by 10 starving, exhausted Jews guarded by a German soldier with a fixed bayonet. In the background, you can see numerous factories with smokestacks, heavily polluting the air. Finally, after decades of searching if any of my father's work from the ghetto could possibly have survived, I was rewarded. At a conference at the University of Lodz in 2004, I learned that David Friedman was a contributor to the Chronicle of the Lodz Ghetto 1941 to 1944, one of the most important documents of Holocaust literature. By a chance introduction, I learned from a historian about an unknown Polish part of the Chronicle found in the attic of the State Archive in Lodz. Over a period of several months, beginning in May 1942, the Chronicle was typed on a special paper for the purpose of printing a header. On the top of the page appeared an etching of a Lodz Ghetto bridge by David Friedman. The chroniclers wrote several versions of their daily entries, and only one of these versions displayed the bridge. The texts were known, but not the pages with the bridge by David Friedman. This newspaper had no readers. This was for future readers. The extent to which my father was aware that his etching was being put to such a use is unknown. David Friedman's etching of the Lodz Ghetto Bridge was published in a new 5-volume German edition of the Chronicle in 2007. And in 2009, it was featured on the cover of the second volume of the Polish version. In 2006, I was alerted by Yad Vashem about contact photos of drawings by my father found in the State Archive in Lodz. They depict various forms of work in the hat manufacturing workshop and were part of an album made documenting the activities of this ghetto workshop, also called Resort. There was a network of factories' cheap war production for the Germans in the Lodz Ghetto. Many such albums were made, typically presented as gifts to Chaim Rumkowski, the chairman of the Lodz Ghetto. The photos were likely by Mendel Grossman and were labeled in Yiddish. The slide displays one of 2 pages of the contact photos from the archive and one example of an enhanced original to show the damaged quality. Nevertheless, this was astonishing evidence of my father's work in the ghetto. I tried to find the original album and connected with researchers and institutes to no avail. And then in 2019, the historian Eva Vietra discovered the original album at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. It was miraculous. 33 priceless drawings survived despite the terrible chaos during the last days of the Lodz Ghetto. We couldn't be more excited, and incredibly, many of the drawings were colorized. The top left is called Trade School. And you can see the students learning about hats. And then the top right is a machine that produces a thread for the machine. And of course, we have the model hats that decorate also the website of the Jewish Historical Institute and the handmade album. Can imagine what a thrill it was to discover this. My father wrote he painted and sketched in pencil, and most importantly, produced portraits of the majority of the directors of about 40 factories for which he received food or other things. So this is how he survived in the Lodz ghetto. The album drawings were produced in soft, beautiful tones, in contrast to his powerfully vivid post-war art. Perhaps he was asked to show the people's willingness to work. After all, their lives depended on work in the factories. David Friedman's legacy fascinates with stories entwined with his artwork. An amazing twist to the discovery is thanks to Aaron Krachmelnik, who I met through Facebook. He saw a resemblance of a portrayed subject, his aunt Fegele Krachmelnik, and sent a photo. I was riveted because I felt that this woman is the subject of my father's drawing, and she was, of course, her ID showed she was a stylist in the hat department. So this is very exciting. The bridge painted in the background personifies the ghetto tragedy as terrified Jews try to flee the Nazi roundup. On the left side of the piece, my father painted himself, perhaps with his wife and daughter at his side. He did not say this was him, but he used himself as a model, as I observed at the time he produced his second series. As the Lodz ghetto was being liquidated, my father was separated from his family and sent to Auschwitz. He was on the last train on August 29, 1944. After the horrific journey in the cattle car and arriving in Auschwitz, the victims were ordered to leave their bundles on the train ramp. Thus, he lost his illustrated diary and art produced in the ghetto. For at least 2 days and 2 nights, we stood in a group of men outdoors. 1,000-watt lamps lit the night. It was forbidden to lie down. We steadied ourselves, supported ourselves, and slept standing. Our brains were empty, eroded. I could not think, nor could I feel hunger. Whoever caved in, fell down, was removed like a piece of wood, and was never seen again. My father knew he could not survive under these conditions. There were no calls for artists. Then one day during roll call, there was an announcement for musicians for a camp orchestra. He volunteered and passed the audition and was sent to Gleiwitz 1. The violin saved him from sure death in the Auschwitz gas chambers. However, at Gleiwitz 1, in competition with concertmasters from the Prague Philharmonic, he failed to win a position and thus was in great danger again. He improvised with primitive materials to paint a mural across the barracks wall to show the SS officers his artistic ability and spare his life. He recalled the painting of the Havel River he produced in Berlin in 1923. Painting was his oxygen and gave him a reason to live, and was a form of resistance. And to my amazement, the painting surfaced about a decade ago, and it was another one of those wonderful connections of the past meeting the present. This was a death march from Camp Gleiwitz 1 to Camp Blechhammer. He wrote, "It took us 48 hours to reach the next camp, Blechhammer in Upper Silesia, Germany. But the fight we took turned out to be a death march. That meant anyone who fell of weakness was shot down pitilessly." This is another view of the death march. My father depicts himself as a prisoner with the eyeglasses to show that he was not only a witness to evil, but also a victim. David Friedman was liberated at Blechhammer on January 25th, 1945, by the Red Army. After liberation, my father made his way back to Prague, arriving in June 1945, sick and with a nervous breakdown. He was determined to fulfill his vow to paint the atrocities he witnessed and produced his first series of 30 drawings. When materials became available, he began to paint. My mother, Hilda, was often his model. In 1983, the American Gathering of Jewish Holocaust Survivors in Washington, D.C. was a perfect venue to show my father's series because they were Jews. Among the visitors to the exhibition was a Yad Vashem director who remarked, "The artwork looked familiar." Later, I received news that 7 of my father's charcoal drawings were in the Yad Vashem collection. This is how my mother and I learned the fate of the photographed drawings produced in Prague in 1945 and displayed in my father's album. So these were the photographs that I had always known in my father's album. And here's an example of what the real drawing looks like. And translated from his description, it says, "This comrade lay in the bed under me. For many days he was no longer capable of going to work. The doctor prescribed a sick barrack. I visited him there. The doctor, who I was friendly with, told me the next day in confidence that the SS inspection had ordered the death pill. They threw him in the corpse chamber. I have portrayed him exactly." The Nazis dehumanized the prisoners, but my father gave each one back their humanity by drawing each victim with detailed facial features and expressions. The drawing on the left was also one of the photographs you saw on the album page. The horrific hunger and destitution in the Lodz ghetto were among my father's main subjects. The hunger drove the starving inmates to eat from trash cans, which was strictly forbidden. If caught, you were shot. The empty bowl personifies the hunger the prisoners suffered. This drawing of the bent-over prisoner was intended for Yad Vashem, but went missing. The location is unknown. This stirring painting is among his first series. The model was my mother. Posing for these very sad scenes was not easy for her, but she always supported my father's art. The marriage of my parents began at a refugee's pace. High-ranking military officers wanted my father's Holocaust art for the War Museum in Prague, but he had other plans. He defied an export prohibition and bribed a sympathetic official who stamped his paintings approved for export. It was dangerous to antagonize the Stalinist regime, known for their anti-Semitic activities, but he was willing to risk everything to save his artwork for Israel. And this was the first residence of my parents, this wonderful tent camp. And he wrote that it was such a beautiful view, and he was delighted to sketch it. And finally, they moved to their new home in Hadar Yosef, which is just north of Tel Aviv. So as you can see, my father chronicled everything in his life. In Israel, he continued to paint still life, landscapes, and portraits. Here is a black and white photo from his album. My father wrote he sold it to a Catholic man in St. Louis. Amazingly, Maurice Wickman found me and sent this color photo. The color made it more evident that it was my father in the right who had painted himself in the background. a woman friended me on Facebook. She bought a miniature painting in an antique shop in a small town in Tennessee. My father had signed in Hebrew. Fascinating where his works have turned up. Iowa, Montana, Florida, and several towns in upstate New York. But they were not Jewish religious art, but pre-war art. My father's art has surfaced around the world, in Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, Belgium, England, France, Italy, the Czech Republic, Poland, Israel, Australia, China, and Canada. Israel was in a poor economic situation, and my father had a young family to support. Despite his age of 61 years, his ambition stretched to America. He had to forget what was hidden in his heart, the pictures from the concentration camps. 10 years after he was liberated from the horrors of the Holocaust, he arrived in New York to begin again. He succeeded in a new career. Just 15 months after arriving in America, he became head painter at the St. Louis branch of General Outdoor Advertiser, a leader in the art of realistic reproduction for outdoor billboards. He mostly painted the iconic Budweiser horses. After retirement in 1962, his art could no longer be silent, and he began the second series. My father fought anti-Semitism and race hatred through painting the horrors he could not erase from his memory. These are the final touches on the last drawings of this series, which went on exhibition in St. Louis and in Baltimore. My parents embraced life and beauty, but never forgot those they left behind. Despite his tragic losses and Holocaust experiences, David Friedman succeeded to leave his mark on the world with important contributions to Holocaust history and the art world. He had persevered and transformed tragedy into a creative and meaningful life. He continued to paint and play his beloved violin until shortly before his death in St. Louis on February 27, 1980, at the age of 86. My mother also wrote testimony and a diary about her harrowing experiences in Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, and Christianstadt, her escape from the death march, and living as a German girl under the nose of the Nazis. She was dedicated to Holocaust remembrance and my father's art, speaking at schools and organizations. My mother died in 1989 at 67 years. It is an ongoing quest to create an inventory of David Friedman's lost works. I appeal to the public to join my search for both his pre-war and post-war production. The Nazi regime nearly eradicated every trace of David Friedman, but they did not succeed. Everywhere he went, he left a legacy for me to find. Searching for lost art is gratifying and a priceless view into his life. I carry on with my father's mission to show his Holocaust art to the world. My goal is to continue to publicize his work through exhibitions, books, and film to preserve his legacy for future generations. I am excited to announce that a documentary film is in production by John Rokosny with the working title, The Art and Survival of David Friedman. There are more amazing stories yet to be told. And these are a list of websites that can be captured once they are on YouTube. Or you can Google David Friedman 1893. And I thank everyone for their great interest and attention, and I appreciate that you came to hear my presentation. Thank you.
Would anyone like to share any questions to Miriam?
It's just some of the stuff your father said. Holocaust is very important to me, so I tend to research about it on my own free time. And in the concentration camps, when they had to, thank you, in the concentration camps, when they had to deal with their, like, basically when they had to move the corpses of their bodies, they weren't allowed to call them corpses. Or bodies, so I found it really interesting. Your dad actually
Well, this is all translated from German, so there could be a little, but I'd have to look at exactly what he wrote, but it was translated from German.
Yeah, if that is.
Why did you hear that they were not called corpses?
They weren't allowed to refer to them.
Well, this was after the war. He could call them whatever he wanted.
Oh no, I mean within the camps, they weren't allowed to refer to the dead, the other people who had been killed in the chambers as corpses. They had to refer to them as either wood, scrags, or excrement. So I thought
So you have to understand this was written after the war. My father's descriptions that I interpreted were written, 5, 6, 10, 15 years later. So he didn't have to follow the rules of what the Nazis wanted to call, the corpses. He was not in the camp when he wrote this.
Oh.
So all the artwork from the Holocaust that you saw is post-war.
What I'm trying to say is I think it's very admirable he would refer to them back to his past experiences. He was just kind of rebelling against what he'd been taught to do in the camps, and I really admired it.
For sure, he was his own man. He would write and show what the atrocities were.
Yeah, I think it's beautiful that he called it what it was instead of not obviously he would call them that, but I thought it was really beautiful that he broke away from the trauma.
Well, he didn't have to follow any rules.
We do have others in the audience who would like to ask questions.
Of course,
so we'll give them all the chance.
I was just going to ask, it seems like your father was so prolific as
Yes.
an artist, and a lot of the art you were showing was, within the decade or so after the Holocaust. But can you just describe growing up with him? What was a day like for him?
Oh.
Do you remember him
Yes.
just constantly having that sketchbook
Yes.
out? And,
Well, everywhere he went, as we went as a family, for example, let's say we went to Forest Park. He would have a sketchbook with him, and he would sketch, and soon a crowd would gather and watch him. He was very prolific. He loved to go out in nature. He accompanied me to the ice skating rink, he did a series of drawings of the ice skaters. I wanted to go to the Science Museum, which was in a beautiful park, and he set himself up with the easel while I went into the museum, and he painted the nature. So we were very close. It was quite a bit of an age difference, you can imagine, but he was very active and we were a very close family. Everything we did together, and I was treated already at 12 like an adult. So I was very much involved with my father's activities. I watched him actually sketch himself with the mirror, which was fascinating. He used himself as a model when he made those drawings, and and I also saw much of his frustration too to have exhibitions. St. Louis was really not the place for him, unfortunately, but he was happy with his life that he had survived.
Any other questions?
You mentioned here at the end that there's a documentary that's currently in the making of your father and everything that he did. If you are allowed to say, because I know that with production things there can be a lot of stuff.
It's just really, we're at the start. We're raising funds for the film, and hopefully we'll succeed.
This isn't really a question, but I just want to say good luck in your quest to find your father's artwork. He was a very talented artist and very profound, as many have said. He's got really amazing works, and I really hope you manage to find all of them.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. A gratitude to President Burns for being with us tonight. Thank you very much.
You can delete it. Oh. Yeah?
Just please know your father and I'm so
Oh, thank you. Thank you so
my
much.
children about making sure that they remember today's my father's birthday. Every time my father's birthday, my mother's birthday, their anniversary, I sang a long message to my children.